You know how people who are different from us are fascinating? We're fascinated by the Amish. We're fascinated by prize fighters and by anybody in the CIA. And I have a feeling that most people watching or listening to the Main Street Vegan podcast are fascinated by veterinarians. We admire them because there's a part of us that wishes we could be doing it. But we're also really stumped. Gosh, why aren't more of them vegan or at least vegetarian? And oh my goodness, there's all the animal testing. Where does the veterinary community come out on this? Well, today we're going to speak with one very special veterinarian who has come out on this issue and who's going to fill us in on all the secrets. We may end up with less fascination and more facts. Hi, everybody. I am Victoria Moran, and this is the Main Street Vegan Podcast, where we are all about vitality, spirituality, and compassion. Thank you so much for listening on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen, or for watching on YouTube at Victoria Moran Official. And if you feel like giving us a like or a follow or, oh my goodness, a subscribe on YouTube, that would just be such a lovely, lovely thing and most appreciated. And I think I said YouTube and not Instagram. You know what? They run together. So, my guest today is Dr. Larry Carbone. He is the author of a really tempeh-y book. You know, I've never quite come up with a good vegan alternative to meaty. I'm going to say tempeh-y book called The Hidden Lives of Lab Animals, a Vet's Vision for a More Humane Future. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Carbone. He's a vet, spent his career caring for animals in medical research labs. While scientists are developing many ways to replace animals in labs, we're not there yet. And if people want new medicines, vaccines, and treatments for human and animal patients, we might not be there for a while. So the book, Hidden Lives of Lab Animals, is Dr. Carbone's call for better care for the animals in labs now until such time as they can be totally replaced. Welcome, Dr. Carbone.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Thanks for having me.
So, what an interesting career you had. It almost sounds like being a doctor in a prison. You're caring for beings who are someplace they don't want to be, probably having lives with a lot of difficulties they shouldn't have to be facing, a lot of pain and suffering they shouldn't have to be facing. And you are called upon to reduce that suffering. So tell us how you got started, how this got started. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, as I write in my book, lots of kids grow up wanting to be a veterinarian. It's so common for me to tell people I'm a vet, and oh, that's what I always want to do, but I wasn't good at math, or lots of kids grow up wanting to be a vet, and certainly nobody ever wants to be a vet in medical research until well on into their studies, they start realizing how important this work is. So for me, what happened was I always wanted to be a vet. I wanted to be a zoo vet. I didn't know that I could find a job as a zoo vet. And when I thought, no, I can't, there just aren't enough openings, I started losing interest in the whole idea of being a vet. And yeah, I found myself in need of a job after I graduated from college and took a job as a vet assistant in the animal research program at Cornell University. Decided this is fascinating. I'm going to go to vet school myself, and this is going to be my job instead of a practice where clients bring me their pets as my patients. I'm going to have scientists as my clients, and their animals are going to be my patients, with the strange twist that there are going to be so many times where my job is more or less protecting those patients from the scientists who own them, are planning experiments but don't quite know the most humane or least inhumane way to do their experiment, or they cut corners on the various rules. So I'm both helping the scientists, helping the animals, getting caught in the middle when there's a conflict between animal welfare and animal use in science. And I decided, I think I'm pretty good at this. I want to stay doing this. So is both the fascination of different kinds of animals. How do you know if a mouse is sick? How do you know if a monkey is feeling pain? So, real fascination with the different kinds of animals I got to work with, and the real intellectual challenge of how do you redesign this experiment so the animals will suffer less? So, it just suddenly the years went by, and both working at a vet school at Cornell and later at a medical school in San Francisco, it just really felt like this is what I should be doing. This helps science, and it helps animals doing this work that I'm doing. So that's how I got there.
So you're now retired and you've
Yeah.
written a book, The Hidden Lives of Lab Animals. I think this is an unusual thing for someone who retires from your particular part of the veterinary profession to do. Were things bothering you for a long time? Did you start out thinking this was all wonderful and noble, and then you started having some kind of conscience pricks?
I had various conscience pricks. Um, and I was fortunate when I was at Cornell to work with uh, a head veterinarian in my program who really questioned things. That was in the mid 80s, which is when all the major animal welfare laws got written and rewritten, not in just the States, but in Europe and Australia. And it was a time, I guess Peter Singer was coming out with his second edition of Animal Liberation, but it was a time when people were thinking a lot about animal rights and how we should rethink our relationship with animals in zoos, in labs, in farms. So it was a really exciting time, and I had a boss who encouraged questioning and thinking. But he too, he was a scientist as well as a veterinarian. He sat me down one day and he said, "Remember, all scientists with animals in their labs are jerks," though he used a less polite word for that. Don't trust them. Don't trust me. Don't trust any of them. And he sort of set up this dynamic that I had to, at the same time I was there to help you run your experiment, I had to always have this sense that there's only so much I'm going to trust you with your animals because they're not your animals. They're this university's animals, and this university is a public entity. So they're the state of New York or later the state of California's animals, to the extent animals should be seen as property. They are not your animals in your lab. And so for a very long time, I've had this kind of conflicted or mixed relationship with scientists who use animals. And I think that's true of most veterinarians who fall into the work I do. Some are more resigned to the use of animals in labs, and partly my book is pushing against that. Well, we know they save lives. To say, well, every single experiment we run with animals, that can't possibly be true. Every single experiment saves lives. So, how do we question what's happening in laboratories while still recognizing that we know? I mean, I'm retired, I'm not a young man. I know that when I was a kid, a diagnosis of any cancer was pretty much a death sentence, right? I knew people in vet school who wanted to go into cancer medicine, but the sad joke almost was, well, how do you do cancer medicine in animals when there are no cancer drugs that work in animals? But now we know, fast forward 40 years, so many cancers are treatable, so many are even curable in people and in animals. We know that as a young gay man in San Francisco or even in New York, HIV, HIV infection, a death sentence. Then miracle drugs came. They didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of science labs. And now the younger generation doesn't even think about HIV treatments because we have HIV prevention. So I know how much medical progress has happened just in my years working in medical research. And it would boggle my mind to think that all those animal experiments didn't contribute to that. So part of my book is written for people like you and other folks who might tune into this podcast who really know nothing about how an experiment is run, what animal testing is, and want to learn some facts. What are experiments like? What are the laws? Do they actually protect the animals? But also written for people who are in science or even people, friends and colleagues I have at PETA or Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine who are trying to work on reforming laboratory animal care and use, things they might want to learn about how things actually work behind the scenes so that we can work for reforms that will actually benefit animals and not just make us feel better. Oh, we have stricter laws, but are those laws helping the animals? So I've written the book both to push people who work heavily on laboratory animal care issues towards thinking about some ways we can improve this, as well as writing for people who are outside who really don't want to think about this issue, but uncomfortably believe that, yeah, maybe I do get something from this. And so maybe I should at least take the responsibility to learn a little bit more about it.
It's quite fascinating. When I was doing research in 1980 for my very first book, Compassion, the Ultimate Ethic, I went to the UK to study vegans. And there were so many vegans who avoided any sort of pharmacological intervention in their own health care
Mhm.
that they possibly could. They had started this nature care college, nature care clinic, so that for ethical reasons, they could avoid not just what we think of as, oh, say, animal tested cosmetics. That's just a thing, that's a life decision. But sometimes with some of these other conditions, it's a big decision, and some people have taken very brave stances on that. And we're all in the midst of it. I mean, almost everybody I know goes to the doctor. And if the doctor writes a
Mhm.
prescription, there is animal laboratory usage somewhere in the history of that drug. So, speaking of history, can you take us back long ways before you or I or all the people listening to this who are probably younger than us were around? Animal experimentation, just like meat eating and some other things we would love to see completely phased out, has been part of human civilization for quite a while. Can you give us a little bit of that background?
Well, yeah, I'll start it in the 1800s. Though certain, yeah, people have been using animals in labs for couple of millennia, dissecting animals back when it would have been completely sacrilege to think about dissecting a human cadaver to try to get some sense of what is a body, what are organs, what does the heart do? Oh, look at that, it pumps blood, and so people have been using animals as surrogates for people, scientists, philosophers, gentlemen of leisure, whatever, uh, just feeling perfectly free to do experiments on animals' bodies for years and years and years, but really start to rise in the late 1800s when science really started to get on this very professional footing. And then again, a big jump mid 1900s when the United States, uh, in the interwar and post World War II period, really started investing heavily in animals and experiments. And very much for as long as people have been doing experiments with animals, people have been resisting that. And so in the 1870s, that's when you really see the first law to protect animals in laboratories, and that was in England. Um, so I'm not surprised you went to England to talk to vegans because England, really, among Western nations, has largely been the leader um, in trying to make humane innovations, as bad as some of what people in England have done for centuries. Um, so the first law to protect some animals and some experiments back in the 1870s focus on pain that animals might experience, setting up some speciesism within the law, so favoring setting special rules for dogs and cats and horses that might be used in labs that favored them over rabbits or pigs or other species of animals who are, as far as I know, equally sentient. Then in the US, for years, the big debate was about getting dogs from dog pounds. So, okay, you can do experiments, but you can't get animals from animal shelters. And you certainly can't steal animals from the streets. So, finally, in the mid 1960s, Congress passed a law, Lyndon Johnson signed it, aimed really at stopping pet theft, still allowing scientists to get dogs from animal shelters, certainly still allowing them to get rabbits and pigs and cats and mice from wherever they could get them. Mid 1980s, some exposés from people who had infiltrated labs where monkeys were used as experimental animals led to a big uproar, and Congress rewrote the Animal Welfare Act to really institute controls over scientists. So in the 60s, the attitude was we couldn't possibly tell scientists how to run their experiments, but what we can do is tell them how to care for those animals at the animal house before they go into the lab, how they can get those animals. That's when you see requirements for having staff veterinarians in science labs. But always the idea and the term they used in the hearings was this law stops at the laboratory door. As soon as the animal goes into the lab, we in Congress have nothing to say about how to design an animal experiment. Well, that changed in the mid 80s. And they said there have to be ethics committees. You have to consider alternatives to using animals. You have to involve veterinarians in planning animal experiments. You have to do your best not to unnecessarily duplicate existing experiments. So that sort of stuff changed in the 80s. And one of my concerns in my book is that was a big change in the 1980s. And we start coloring in the details of how to do this better. But I think it's time to take some next steps forward to improve the lot of animals in laboratories.
Well, let's just jump forward to now. And
Mhm.
there's a lot going on. There's a lot in the news about changes in what's being allowed. There's some testing being banned, some species being taken out of the system. So, where are we right now today in 2026?
I have 2 ears, and in one ear, I listen closely to a lot of what animal protectionists are saying, especially those who are really focused on this issue, animal rights groups. Um, that includes the people who are really working hard to develop non-animal laboratory alternatives, replacements for use of animals. And the other are the folks who are working in the animal labs. And often the discussions I hear there are essentially nothing has changed. Of course, we're more humane and we're more careful about the animals, but really it's all still the rules we have work fine. The experiments we do are vital. So I have these two ears focused and I'm trying to synthesize all this. So what do I see happening right now? I see incredible advances in technologies that can get animals out of laboratories in three directions, in three ways. One is there's so much more we can do with human volunteers than we could do 25, 30 years ago with things like non harmful brain imaging, where a person will sit calmly and think pleasant thoughts, and you can see what parts of the brain light up, and you can see how people with different diseases, incipient Alzheimer's, do that differently. So there's so much more we can do with human volunteers. There's AI that can generate ideas for what if we did this three-dimensional model of this molecule that might block avian influenza virus from getting into a mammalian or a human cell. Let's redesign this smartly instead of scouring through nature trying to look for a compound that might have that potential. Actually, intelligently designing that. And then AI also has a role in screening for likely safety issues with that. And then there's all this amazing work scientists are doing that should have been better funded 30, 40, 50 years ago by the NIH and other science funders to say, what can we do with human cells to develop essentially miniature organs and have them communicate with each other? So a little human liver organoid that somehow communicates with the replica of the human immune system that maybe replicates with cells from the pancreas so that we can try to explore diabetes drugs, but look for their effect on the liver. So all of this is advancing so amazingly and so quickly. So all of these are reasons to see could be, hopefully soon, animals will no longer be in labs. But there's this counter current. And this is one of the things I talk about in my book that I worry a lot about. We can genetically reprogram so many animals and people and human cells and plants. We can genetically engineer things. And one of the things I'm really afraid of is genetically engineering new monkeys who are going to be more susceptible to human psychiatric diseases so that we can try to have a monkey version of depression or anxiety disorders. And so it's actually at the same time there's progress towards replacing animals, there's progress, there's moves towards making things, in my estimation, potentially much worse for animals.
Ooh.
So that's the current lay of the land as I see it. There's great promise and there's great danger.
So, eternal vigilance. So, let's talk a little bit about the literal title of your book, The Hidden Lives of Lab Animals. So, let's talk about the animals that I think are used the most, the rodents, the mice, the rats, the guinea pigs. So tell us who they are. I actually had a couple of pet mice back in my 20s, Clementine and
Hmm.
Priscilla. Fascinating to get to know them, but I think most people have not known beings of these species, and so many, I believe I can say billions of them are used in laboratory experiments around the world. So let us in on the life of a rodent and the differences among them.
Well, yeah, I think whenever people have said to me, I want to get a hamster for my kids, like, no, get a rat. Get a rat. They're so smart. They're so social. A hamster wants to sleep all day long, doesn't want your kid bothering them. And people say, oh, but the tail, it freaks me out. But once you get past that, rats in particular are so easy to get to know. And that includes for lab workers, whether it's a technician or a student doing experiments, whether it's for the animal care staff, the professionals who are there to care and clean and monitor health in those rats, they develop relationships with them, both as a group, but also sometimes with individual rats. Mice are a little tougher, but people who get to know mice certainly see, oh, these animals are curious, they have lives to live, they've got their own agenda. And so they're as capable as we are of feeling pain, feeling fear, feeling anxiety. So I do worry about them a lot. Now, I write a fair bit about the laws in the United States and other countries. In our flagship law in the United States, the Animal Welfare Act, it excludes those animals. It gives a definition of a research animal that explicitly says a mouse or a rat bred for research is not an animal. And what does that mean? That means that when I had a job for a while as the compliance person for animal welfare at a university, and the government inspector, a veterinarian working for the Department of Agriculture, would come to the door for a surprise visit and say, okay, well, I'm in this building today. I want you to first show me all the animals, and I'll look at the records. I would walk them past rooms full of mice and rats so we could get to a room with pigs or even gerbils, who are animals, so they could inspect those animals, but they'd walk past the thousands of mice and hundreds of rats to get to the animals that count. When I'd show them the records documenting our animal ethics committee and the issues they covered, I'd always have to make sure they understood. Now, this page you're looking at, this is only talking about mice and rats. So as far as you're concerned, they're invisible. So it's been a campaign of mine for 25 years or more. These animals should count as animals. What it also means is that when we think about how many are there, well, you can go to the USDA's website and you can find out how many dogs and guinea pigs and monkeys and pigs are in United States labs, but you can't find how many mice and rats. We don't report those. We count them and report them to the NIH, but the NIH has not been big on transparency itself. It complies with freedom of information and open records laws. But when I wrote to the NIH a few years ago, I was working on a paper to try to figure out how many mice and rats are in American labs. And I know every lab that gets NIH funding reports to the NIH. And I said, so can you give me the number? You must tally those reports when you get them from the thousand or so laboratories you fund. And the response was, no, we don't tally those. And we're not going to tally them for your request. You can request them individually and you can tally them. But even in 2026, when all this information is submitted electronically to the NIH, they still don't tally and report the number of animals in the labs that they fund. So that too is something I would change if I ruled the world. So yeah, these animals, and informally, and this is part of the value, I think, of having an insider like me. I'm not trying to cast stones at anyone, but I know that when I was working in a compliance role and I would bring issues to the animal ethics committee, who had jurisdiction over whether scientists could continue with their experiments or must take a time out and get retrained, I would sometimes almost devilishly present a case and say, well, I visited a lab and they had approval to do surgery on their animals. And I found that they weren't using all the painkillers they were committed in their approved protocol with this committee to use. And these are more of the facts about this. But I wouldn't tell them the kind of animal until they asked. And once I told them the kind of animal, you could I didn't have to listen for a sigh of relief. I could hear, whoa, whoa, oh my goodness. If this had been a covered species, we could really be in trouble when the inspector comes. It's like, well, it is technically a covered species insofar as the NIH has some rules overseeing the labs they fund, and those do cover mice and rats. But you in this ethics committee, even informally, you take things seriously to different levels depending on not just is this a dog, because we know there's so much public concern about dogs, or is this a monkey, because you can make a big deal about mistreatment of monkeys, but is this a pig or a rabbit that doesn't have nearly the constituency that dogs and monkeys have, but still has legal protections a mouse and a rat lacks. So even informally, behind the scenes, these animals are second class or third class citizens. And for me, that should change. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. And
Oh, this
Sorry.
is information that I think so many of us don't have. I can speak for myself and probably the majority of my listeners. We consider ourselves abolitionists in this area. I'm a proud card-carrying member of PETA. Animals are not ours to eat, wear, experiment on, or use for entertainment. And yet, this is the world we live in. And
Mhm.
to get this information is utterly fascinating and I think really important for all of us. So I know that a lot of the experimentation, and perhaps you can give us a percentage, what is done in terms of actual physical ailments, what's done about cancer and infectious diseases and some of these other things, versus what's done for what lay people reading these, it just seems silly. Some of the behavioral stuff, in the old days when they used to make monkeys smoke, why didn't people just stop smoking instead of making the monkeys smoke? I mean, it was completely uh, to me nonsensical. And then we've got product testing. And that's an area where we as consumers, I think, can really make a difference because we can literally just say no to cosmetics, household cleaners, that kind of things tested on animals. So, can you just kind of lay out these various areas for us? Tell us the percentages
Yeah,
of animals involved and what's going on there.
yeah, and there's so many different ways in which animals are used in laboratories. And when I worked at the medical university in San Francisco, I had cancer biologists, nutritionists, cardiologists, surgeons, bone healing, orthopedic surgeons, so many different kinds of infectious disease specialists, vaccine specialists, all trying to do research and all using a combination of ways of doing research. So diabetes researchers, we would say to them, so you want permission to do animals, why aren't you using human cells in culture? And the response was typically, well, of course we're using human cells in culture. It's a very simpler system. It's easier to get a readout that we can work with. But for some things where we know that hormones and the brain and blood flow and kidney health and all these different things go into response to diabetes, we're at a stage where there are things we can't quite do in people that we don't trust we could do enough with just some human cells in some culture systems. So, of course, we have studies going on with human patients, with cells in culture, and with animals. So virtually everybody I worked with as scientists had those three kinds of approaches to trying to study what they were trying to study. The big difference was a handful of people working with monkeys in brain function labs who had computer simulations they were doing, but didn't have a much they were able to do with brain organoids or other uh, synthetic replacements for animals to study learning, to study how the brain processes information. Those folks, of course, are profiting from advances in human technologies where they can do more with human volunteers. But one way of thinking about this, I think, is there's a spectrum from initially trying to develop new ideas about how the body works, especially in certain diseases, to sort of the end stage. Now we're ready to try a product, a medicine, um, a sunscreen, whatever it is, in human volunteers. And before we go to human volunteers who want to know, well, how safe is this going to be to me to volunteer for this trial? That end stage of things. So that's testing. This is research. The testing is where there's really, really been incredible progress in replacing animals with non human things so that for the most part, before we essentially ask animals to volunteer to test some product, it's already gone through a battery of tests without animals. so that for the most part, things are only getting to animals if they really look promising that they're going to be effective and they're going to be safe. Drug companies put years and millions of dollars into even that end stage testing before they get their human volunteer studies going. And they don't want to invest in those animal experiments for a product that hasn't passed every other test on the way to animals. They have a vested interest in not jumping into animal studies prematurely. Now, the beginning stages of things, something I think a lot about, because in the United States, there's now pretty much a government, almost a government ban, at least on funding research on mRNA, messenger RNA. That's the basis of the most effective COVID vaccines and possibly the basis of the most effective vaccines for coming pandemics that emerge. Well, where did that come from? Well, it came from trying to figure out what's DNA. How does it work? Oh, it works through this intermediary called mRNA. What the Wouldn't it be crazy if if you engineered mRNA and you put it into a human body and it started making the human cells make proteins from a COVID virus that taught the human body to recognize that as something it should attack as a foreign enemy, so that you have a vaccine that tells the body this thing you're making, you should see as an enemy and you should fight it. And if you see it again, when a virus gets into your body, you should fight. This is amazing. This felt like science fiction to me when I first learned about it. And it turns out to be really, really amazing and safer than you would think. It's like, wait, you put this genetic material into the body and that doesn't do all sorts of wacky things to the body. So that has to go through all sorts of tests in vitro, in flasks, in human cells to see, oh, yeah, look at that. You put it into these cells and they really do start making this product. And look at that. You expose human immune cells to this substance in in flasks, in discs, on slides, and it really does start recognizing this as something it should fight. Are we ready to jump into people? Maybe not. Maybe we're going to take that other step and see, does it do the same thing in mice without triggering an autoimmune response that they attack all of their own cells because of this thing you put in them? And then even once they make the antibodies, do those antibodies, particularly those antibodies, actually make disease less severe? So it's this really complex technology. Right now, the United States government is turning its back on it. I can't even begin to get into the politics of what's happening with health and medical research in the United States. But so but again, all of this, for those of us inside animal labs who are thinking, well, of course, at some point you have to ask human volunteers to volunteer for part of this work. And there was even a movement to get human volunteers to accept an intentional infection with COVID vaccine. Young, healthy volunteers who know that in young, healthy people, it's not usually such a devastating disease. And there were people lined up who wanted to volunteer to receive live virus. Maybe they had the vaccine, maybe they had placebo, but to see, does it actually affect the outcome? But all of us, to those of us inside the animal laboratories, well, of course, there are things you might learn from using animals, things you mostly learn from using human cells in culture systems, things you might use with human volunteers. And most of us in the animal world think, but you pull out one of those legs from that stool, it is going to fall. Now, I know you've voiced a stance on some of your podcasts that's a stance I really very much respect, which is, what about just saying, even if a vegan diet requires me to get some outside nutrients like vitamin supplements, or even if it were true, which it's not, the vegan diet isn't as healthy as a more omnivorous diet, I still don't want to exploit animals. I'm not going to participate with it. And if there are risks to that, I'm not going to take those risks. Even if there are good things that might come from my health, from some medical advances, I don't want to participate in that. I want to say no to that. What gets trickier, I think, as an ethical stance is saying, even if cancer treatments that might help my child might come from animal tests, we are going to say no to that. Or, from my loved one, we're not, we're going to say no to that. We're going to be conscientious objectors. I love my pets. Well, you think there's an available vaccine in dogs that didn't come through animal testing? And the answer is no. Could we freeze all of that right now? Well, we already have a lot of progress. So if we said, let's just stick with what we've got, and going forward, the only medical advances we're going to go for are things that did not require harming animals in laboratories. Well, we might slow some progress in some areas, but it's not sending us suddenly back to the 15th century that, oh, it's the plague. We've got a lot of stuff already. For me, I think we still want advances in malaria prevention. There are tens of millions of kids at risk of malaria, and a really effective vaccine, if that required animal testing for part of that, maybe that's something we should say yes to. But there are so many other things that I would say no to. I wrote a letter to the editor to Science because I always have to have my voice heard, because I saw some experiments a few months back that used monkeys to explore whether animals other than humans, great apes, and some birds could recognize rhythm in music. Well, one way of doing that might be to train monkeys to tap, tap, tap in response to music they hear, and then see if, okay, you learned how to do this in time with the song. Um, I think the Backstreet Boys were one of the songs they used. Now, can you extrapolate that to other songs? And this could be really important to understanding the evolution of human appreciation of music. But to get the monkeys to do that, they put them in cages. They restricted them from water overnight so they'd be willing to work for a sip of water to recognize the music. And so I just wrote and I said, there may be really important reasons to still use animals in labs, but our curiosity about human evolution, and I'm fascinated by human evolution. Anytime I read something about new fossils being found, I want to read about it, but not at the expense of hurting animals. So when I talk about there's next steps we need to take in animal labs, one of those is getting really stricter about saying, how important is this experiment in animals? Because animal ethics committees look about, oh, well, do you have to hold them off water overnight? Wouldn't 5 hours off water get them thirsty enough? Or, do you really need to house them singly for this experiment? Could you find a way to group house them and then still get them to respond in your experiment? It's all looking at harm reduction. It's mostly looking at harm reduction, but not looking closely enough at what are the benefits that could justify this. And there are a lot of experiments. I can always spin a story of, yes, because we know this now about this cell in the kidney, this could be important information. But even I run out of stories sometimes of, oh, yeah, maybe there are people who can't really appreciate music rhythm, and that would justify harming monkeys for some information. Even I run out of those stories, and it's like, I'm sorry that you don't appreciate music rhythm, but maybe that's one we as a society should say this isn't important enough. But we don't currently have a good method for filtering that out.
This is such a fascinating conversation to me because I live very much in the vegan world. And for probably 50 years, everything that I have read and studied in terms of animal experimentation is about getting the animals out of the labs, coming up with alternatives, ending this thing. And I see in talking to you that it is much more entrenched than I understood. And there are different ways of looking at things. I've never looked at life as a scientist does. And it's very interesting to listen to you because you really are on the line. I want to read to everybody what you wrote on your questionnaire at the end. I always give people a little opportunity to say, well, just tell us something, we really ought to know that doesn't come up in the regular questions. And you said, and this is a quote from Dr. Carbone, though I've worked in medical research my whole life, I've kept close contacts with friends and colleagues in animal rights and animal protection. In a polarized world full of mutual accusations and mistrust, I am charting a course that listens to both sides. End of quote. And thank you for doing that. I think that
Thank you.
even those listening who really disagree and think you ought to completely jump out of their side and be fully in our side can honor that you are willing to have this conversation. And as we know, in political areas and social justice and all these areas, people just aren't talking. And so maybe we in the animal protection world can do a little better job of talking with one another and maybe let that ripple out to help not only animals, but human society. So as we wind down, I do want to do a shout out to our sponsor, Complement, wonderful supplements for your whole food plant-based diet. These are made by vegans for vegans. The website is lovecomplement.com. They have so many wonderful products. One of my favorites is the chocolate protein powder because it really tastes chocolate. And I have my chocolate shake in the morning, and no matter what else is going on in my life, I can have that little bit of happy sunshine knowing that I get to have a chocolate shake for breakfast. And here is some other good news. If you go to lovecomplement.com and put in the discount code Main Street, all capital letters, you will get 10% off, not just on your first order, but forever and ever and ever, because I am grandmothered in. How cool is that? So back to our guest today, Dr. Larry Carbone. The book is The Hidden Lives of Lab Animals, A Vet's Vision for a More Humane Future. And we will put the information on the book and URLs for Dr. Carbone and his work in the show notes at mainstreetvegan.com. So finally, last question, Dr. Carbone, and thank you so much for your time and for all the time that you put into researching and writing this very, very thoughtful and insightful book. What can we as consumers, as people out in the world making choices about health and beauty and how to clean the sink, what can we do to help lab animals suffer less and be used less?
Yeah, it's such a challenge. For years we all talked about, well, go for cruelty-free cosmetics, but I know you had this conversation with Melanie Kaplan a few months back. Cruelty for cosmetics mostly it's hard to find cruelty inclusive cosmetics these days. Cosmetics just are not tested on animals. They were in the past. But there are cosmetic adjacent things like sunscreens, like all sorts of things. Just I think part of it is being mindful and recognizing that everything we consume has a price, whether it's in human rights and human welfare, animal rights, animal welfare, and just lowering our consumption a bit. I encourage buying organic. I have no illusions that there's no potential killing of animals or harming of animals, even in producing a local vegan diet, agriculture harms animals, but vegan agriculture harms animals less than what we're doing to grow meat. So certainly, that's one of the first things I recommend in my book is try to lower your own consumption of animals and animal products. And then I go a little further. I know people will hit closed doors, but there are animal ethics committees any place in no matter where you live. There's a college, there's a company, there's a biotech, there's a university. They have animals, and they have animal ethics committees. By law, they have animal ethics committees, and by law, those committees include outsiders, and they include non-scientists. And I always encourage people, knock at the door, do your homework on, oh, there is this university in my town, New York, if that's where you are. It's got dozens of universities with animal labs, and all of them are supposed to have community representatives. And you can find transparency is such a challenge, but you can find information about who's using animals in your neighborhood and get in touch and say, I'd like to know more. I'm not here to condemn you. I'd like to know more. And maybe there's a role for me engaging with this. It's a possibility. It's a challenge. You'll probably get a closed door, but it's worth a try. But yes, as consumers, um, recognize that all medicines have come through animal labs. Increasingly, the role of animals is going down, and the harmful use of animals is going down. And I also hope people won't jump to science denialism. I think a lot of us in animal care are worried that people who think it's best not to vaccinate their own children. I'm not an MD. I won't weigh in on that. But there's spillover where people think, and therefore I should also not vaccinate my dog or my cat. I have seen what distemper looks like in unvaccinated dogs, what parvo looks like, what feline distemper, panleukopenia looks like in unvaccinated cats. These are horrible diseases. Please recognize that even those vaccines were developed using laboratory mice, cats, dogs. They're lifesavers for your own pets. And please, 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 please don't take those risks with your own animals for whom you're responsible. Um, that's
Ah,
my part of my soapbox.
thank you. Thank you so much for being on your soapbox for the Main Street Vegan podcast today. Thank you very much. And good advice. We need to take care of ourselves. We need to take care of those charged for us
Yeah,
to
yeah,
take care of. And there's always a lot to think about, and how wonderful that we are thinking. I think one of the saddest
yes.
and scariest things in society today is that so many people just see something pop up on a social media feed, and all of a sudden it's the gospel truth. And I think that those of us with brains to use, we really do need to be using them, our brains and our hearts. And thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you.
Carbone.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much from listening to your podcast myself,
Oh,
and thank you for inviting me. And
thank
yeah,
you.
yeah,
Ah,
okay.
well, it is one of the great blessings of having a podcast is getting to talk to incredible people every single week. We're now in our 15th year, so I have really hit the jackpot on getting to talk with interesting, fascinating, and dedicated folks. And many of them are listeners to this podcast. So thank you so much for being one of those, a listener, or now that we're on YouTube, a viewer. So bless you. Thank you. And now let's just all get out there and make Main Street vegan.